So good morning, I'm Megan Matheson. I'm the co-lead of the Canadian Marine Shipping Risk Forum, and I'm also the Director of Strategy and Innovation for Clare Seas Centre for Responsible Marine Shipping. So before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that I'm joining from the traditional ancestral lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations and express my gratitude for their stewardship of these lands and waters since time immemorial. So for a few brief introductions, the Canadian Marine Shipping Risk Forum is a community of practice that's hosted by MEOPAR, the Marine Environmental Observation, Prediction and Response Network, and Clare Seas. The community of practice is open to all who are interested in the work of understanding and mitigating shipping risk. Thank you for joining us today. Our session is focused on balancing environmental protection with tourism using the case example of the Glacier Bay Marine Park in Alaska. So I'll ask all participants remain muted during the presentation, but you are highly encouraged to raise your hand and unmute to ask any questions afterwards. We're quite a small group today, so I think that hopefully people are keen on this topic and have lots of questions for Scott. If you prefer, or if your situation doesn't allow you to raise your hand or ask your question directly, go ahead and type your question into the chat and I will be glad to read it out for you. If you would like to introduce yourself to everyone else assembled here, please feel free to put your message into the chat and introduce yourself to everyone here. You can say a little bit about your organization or what you do, or what you're particularly interested in about this topic. And so our presenter today is Scott Gende, and Scott is a senior science advisor with the National Park Service based out of Juneau, Alaska. He has been working there for a number of years and has, among other things, his work includes research on harbor seals and how they respond to cruise ship disturbances. His background in education includes a degree in fish and wildlife biology from the Iowa State University, a master's in science and fisheries and ocean science with the University of Alaska, and his doctorate from the University of Washington in the School of Aquatic and Fishery Sciences. And you can find an extensive list of publications on the National Park Service website for Scott. So today he's going to be talking about the approach that's been taken to protect the environment in the pristine Glacier Bay National Park using a range of tools and incentives that allows cruise ship passengers to access and enjoy the area, but protects the environment for years to come. And this case study has potential applications for regions elsewhere, including Canadian waters that are facing increased interest from the cruise sector, such as Arctic communities and marine protected areas. So I will hand over to Scott now to begin his presentation, and you should be able to share your screen, but if you have any difficulties, we'll sort those out.
Thanks, Megan. I'll try sharing my screen and just shout out if something goes amiss here. Okay, can you see my screen okay?
Not yet.
All right, stand by.
Should see the green arrow at the bottom of your screen. Oh, there we go. We are making progress there. Yeah, if you want to just switch to full screen mode, I think that'll be great.
Okay, I'm full screen mode. Can you see my screen now?
Yes, I can. Looks great. Okay. Beautiful glacier.
Well, thanks, Megan. Sorry for all the technical delays. I thought these sleek gamer headphones that I got off my son 2 days ago would resolve all my technological issues, but clearly not. Anyways, thanks for joining. Again, my name is Scott Gende. I work for the National Park Service in Juneau, Alaska, and for better or for worse, I've been working on cruise tourism in and around Glacier Bay National Park for the last 22 years or so. And I'm just going to share some of these ideas that and initiatives that have evolved. I'd love to say I was the brainchild of all of them. I'm not. The park has been developing these things for the last 50 years or so. So would love to take credit, but hoping that it just plants a seed for ideas of what's possible. So really quickly, I'm just going to kind of introduce you to Glacier Bay National Park, including the park objectives. Area management 101 is, clearly defined objectives so you can identify what constitutes your metrics of success. And then describe very briefly about what I call kind of the 5 pillars of sustainable visitation that we follow. Um, the park, as I'll describe, allows in a suite of different type of marine vessels. I'm going to focus almost exclusively on large cruise ships. I know that this applies to some of you, that your concerns over large cruise ship management. We also have smaller expedition style ships and off-ship activities. There just wasn't enough time to kind of get into the weeds about management approaches for each one of these. So, maybe some other time we could focus more on those types of vessels, but for now, just kind of focusing on the large ships. And perhaps more importantly, I just want to say that what I'm presenting is kind of, I hope you view as more as kind of what's possible. And every area and protected area, every port, every strait is a little bit different. So these ideas are not necessarily reflective of what's feasible or what's necessary or effective or even what's appropriate. And so if anything else, just kind of describing, given the conditions, what we have and what we had, how we develop these initiatives, and maybe there might be some things you could tailor to your own situation. And, building on that, in 2019, I helped organize a meeting in Glacier Bay of almost all the World Heritage Marine sites. 39 countries, something on the order of 46 sites were represented. And even though the sites were Pan-Arctic or equatorial, subequatorial, or south and north and northern hemisphere, it was pretty remarkable how similar some of the concerns were at these sites. And in some cases they apply in Glacier Bay, in some cases they don't. But there's what I really hope to do is build this coalition of this community of practice of areas and places that are dealing with emerging or increasing or sustained cruise ship visitation, because the issues really can span across the globe for protected areas and ports of call. So just by way of introduction, Glacier Bay National Park is in southeastern Alaska, that abuts the North Pacific. This kind of map shows the park in relation to the other areas that constitute one of the largest transboundary World Heritage sites in the world, with our Canadian colleagues at the Tatchinchini and Alsek River and Kluane National Park. I also plotted this to show the route of the typical cruise ships that visit Alaska. Most passengers fly into Vancouver, Seattle, or Victoria, hop on the ship, and then come up through the Inside Passage to Alaska, some of which visit Glacier Bay. So if you kind of focus in on that green area, here's the large World Heritage Site. Glacier Bay is down the lower right-hand corner, and you focus furthermore into the park. Glacier Bay is the Y-shaped fjord at the center of the screen there, and Glacier Bay National Park and Preserve is in the green outline. And one of the unique factors about Glacier Bay is that the Park Service has jurisdictional control over the marine waters. So for everywhere outside of Glacier Bay proper, which is that Y-shaped fjord right there in the middle, the jurisdiction goes from mean high tide mark out to 3 nautical miles offshore, but includes all of the waters of Glacier Bay. So about 2,500 square kilometers, in addition to all the terrestrial lands within the green marker. Another somewhat unique aspect of Glacier Bay is that it's almost completely roadless. I've highlighted all the roads in the park in red there, and if you're squinting your eyes, you can see there's one tiny road that connects the park headquarters down in Bartlett Cove to the small gateway community of Gustavus, about 400 year-round residents. And Gustavus in and of itself isn't connected by road to anywhere outside of Alaska. So effectively, the only way into or out of or be able to visit the park is through marine vessel. And again, this is the boundary of the park of which every vessel that comes into the park is required to have a permit. So the park was set aside for protection in 1925, in part because of the very rapid change in tidewater glaciers in the area, which has been documented over the last several centuries. Early explorers discovered these walls of ice. Of course, they've been known to Hunahklinket for a millennium, that represented an incredible opportunity to understand and study the successional dynamics and landscape scale evolution that occurs with the rapid changes in retreat of tidewater glaciers. So reflecting this is the upper photo shows in the right-hand fjord of the Y-shaped fjord, we call the east arm, is looking into McBride Inlet. The photo shows from 1941, the same picture 70 years later, showing how remarkable changes the landscape has undergone. The other reason, in addition to the scientific opportunities to study landscape scale evolution, is that the tidewater glaciers were accessible to by quote unquote ordinary travel, which in the 1920s was by large steamship and has since evolved into large cruise ships. So people still come to visit the tidewater glaciers. It's also established a reputation of being a hotspot for marine wildlife. It's a very productive area, year-round active upwelling, and provides great opportunities for not just marine-based tourism, but land-based to enjoy and access the whole suite of successional forest and landscape stages. So when people come into the park, they generally do so by marine vessel, and they go up to the tidewater glaciers. Again, this is our objective. We want to have people access the fjord, and we want to get people to the tidewater glaciers. It's why the park was set aside. And cruise ships do an extraordinary job of providing a very large diversity and range, the types of passengers, and getting them close to the glaciers where their visitor experience is very, very high. So how do people access the park? Well, it's the Park Service manages, Park Service manages the vessels that come into the park by effectively categorizing it using 4 different vessel types. Private vessels, and those vessel types are ascertained based on their tonnage and their ownership and the capacity for overnight passengers. Private vessels are the only vessel type that's not commercially operated in the park. And those are any size. The only qualification is they basically need to be not used for commercial purposes. Cruise ships are over a certain tonnage where there's over a certain number of overnight passengers that can be accommodated, and people do not, on large cruise ships, passengers don't disembark the ship. They stay on the ship the entire time. They enter the park in the morning. They spend the day in the ship as it transits the park, goes up to the tidewater glaciers, and exits in the early afternoon, or early to late afternoon. Tour vessels are effectively smaller cruise ships. They are allowed off-ship activities, and those are over a certain tonnage, and allow for overnight of a certain number of minimum number of overnight passengers. And charter vessels are under a certain vessel tonnage and include off-ship activities, but for a smaller number of people. But effectively searching for vessel types that provide a range of experiences to enjoy and access the park. One of the reasons I kind of focus on large cruise ships is because they are so instrumental in helping the Park Service meet its mandate of providing access and enjoyment to the tidewater glaciers. And since the late 1960s, cruise ship passengers has constituted about 95 to 98% of all the visitors to the park. And this has occurred across the decades and represents, a means by which a range of visitors access and enjoy the park resources. And so they're critically important, both from a visitation and visitor experience and a sustainability standpoint. So given the different 4 vessel classes, we, the National Park Service, effectively instill sustainable practices in each one of the vessel classes using somewhat similar tenets. And I've listed kind of these 5 pillars of sustainable visitation: regulation, competition, education, monitoring, research, and partnerships. And I'm not going to focus on all 5 of these. There's just not enough time to get into the weeds, like I mentioned. Really, I'm going to focus on regulation, competition, and education. But if aside from the private vessel, the bottom 3 pictures show the 3 different commercial class types of vessels, and each one of those is kind of passed through these filters of these 5 kind of pillars of sustainable operations. So again, I'm focusing on large cruise ships, for another time, maybe perhaps on expedition style ships. I recognize that probably some of you out there are dealing more with the smaller vessels and off-ship activities, and it would be great to have a conversation to discuss what those issues are and some commonalities, maybe if some of those apply in Glacier Bay. So in terms of regulation, like I mentioned, the Park Service has the ability to regulate the volume, both the volume and the operating conditions of each one of these vessel classes. And for large cruise ships, the Park Service has designated that a maximum of 2 ships are allowed into the park per day. And they also have a seasonal quota. And that seasonal quota is for the June, July, and August summer season. And there's also a May and September off season. But for now, just focusing on the summer season. So in other words, in June, July, and August, there are 30, 31, and 31 days. So 92 days total. If you had a maximum of 2 ships that come in every day, 2 ships times 92 days is 184 ships for the season. But the seasonal quota is set at 153. So what that means is that for most of the summer season, there are 2 large ships that come in per day. But there are some days when only 1 ship comes in, and every so often, no ships in the park. We also regulate operating conditions, including speeds and area closures and approach distances. And I've put up kind of a map here of the regulations we have in place for the different vessel types. And to be honest, this is not very innovative, in my opinion, just because if you have regulatory authority and you don't want, ships to get within 200 meters of a seabird colony, you can do that. And there's always research that goes into the implications of imposing any of these operating conditions on any of the vessels. But really, that's I find this less insightful than some of the other pillars, including the competition and the education component. So, but a key thing about this is that while we can regulate the volume and operating conditions of the cruise ships that come in, we are not allowed by law to regulate anything having to do with air, oil, or water management, because they fall under the management authority of other U.S. agencies, including the Coast Guard and the Environmental Protection Agency. So it's interesting that while some of the main concerns, across protected areas, including Glacier Bay, is how do you protect air quality? How do you protect water quality? We can't regulate the things that influence those resources and values. So there's a different way by which we approach that. And that way is through this kind of market-based tool that has been developed over the last several decades. And I'm just going to describe very briefly how this works. So before I do, I want you to recognize that the cruise industry is a very competitive market. And this is, granted, this is pre-pandemic list of a sampling of the number of companies that offer cruise ships and cruise ship services. Some of these companies no longer exist, but nevertheless, cruising is very popular, and the cruise experience is diversifying. So it's not just the large ships going to the Caribbean or Alaska and the smaller expedition ships. It's everything in between. And so there's a real demand and a real supply for people globally to go on cruises and experience places via cruise ship. So as a reminder, the Park Service implements a 2-ship daily quota and a seasonal quota as well. And so most of the other ports of call in Alaska can accommodate 4 or 5 large ships per day. And so effectively in the entire Alaska market, the National Park Service has limited the quota, which reduces the supply for ships that access Glacier Bay. And so we impose this kind of competitive tool, this market-based tool, to allocate those 153 seasonal entries. And this is the way we do it. Every 10 years, the Park Service puts together what they call a concessions prospectus for cruise ship services. And this is, for example, applied to the 153 seasonal use days in the summer. Now that concessions prospectus is sent out to all the cruise companies that may have any interest whatsoever in bringing ships to the park. And in that prospectus includes selection factors that we write that reflect a number of things, including what we feel would be the most sustainable operations to conserve the resources and values in the park. The companies that have an interest in bringing their ships to Alaska and to Glacier Bay respond with proposals in response to those selection factors. And each one of those selection factors have a score that they can achieve a certain number of points. Those proposals are then ranked by an independent panel. So I help write the selection factors, but I don't see any of the proposals. That's an independent panel that ranks those based on those individual scores. And then the companies with the highest scores are awarded 10-year contract for cruise ship services. So they get exclusive access to Glacier Bay based on what they proposed, should they be awarded 10-year contracts. And we used to do 5-year contracts, but the companies came back and said they would prefer more market certainty on a 10-year timescale. So that's what we adapted to do. And so then for 10 years, those companies get permits to bring their ships to Glacier Bay, and they can market that they have Glacier Bay on their itinerary and use this brand for marketing and filling the ships. So what do those selection factors look like? There's 5 principal selection factors, all of which can be scored up to 5 points. The last one, selection factor 5, is a minimum franchise fee. That's what cruise companies propose to pay on a per passenger basis should they be allowed into Glacier Bay. And those are a maximum of 4 points. It's slightly lower than the other 4 selection factors, so that the dirty ships can't just buy their way into the top of the rankings. But for now, just recognize that there are selection factors, some of which are related to things other than sustainability, in the grandest sense, in that you don't want a company, you want to make sure they're financially capable of following through on their services and not going bankrupt. But selection factor 1 is focused on, has a fair amount of language on protecting, conserving, and preserving park resources and values. There are also several secondary selection factors with points that can be added on, focused on things like energy waste reduction, recycling. So in the prospectus, we say, what will you do to reduce greenhouse gases? What will you do to minimize solid waste production? How would you maximize recycling programs? There are selection factors focused on conservation of marine wildlife, disturbance to harbor seals or humpback whales. There's another secondary selection factor focused on underwater and above ground noise, how they operate to conserve the natural soundscapes both above and below the water by operating in a certain way. So, I could send you and share that prospectus, but what's really insightful is kind of understanding once those proposals are selected. So in other words, the top ranking companies are awarded those contracts and therefore permits. We write into their operating plans what they're required to do based on what they propose to do in response to the prospectus. So I just listed here a whole suite of things that the companies that were awarded contracts have agreed to do that are contractually legally obligated to operate by, having to do with oil spills, noise, underwater and above water, air and water quality. This is really interesting because, again, the Park Service can't regulate anything having to do with air, oil, and water. So what we did is put in there, we would say, what would you do to minimize the impacts to air quality or water quality? And every company that was awarded a contract came back and said, we will not operate incinerators while we're not just in the park, but anywhere in the general area of the park. We will operate on marine gas, ultra low sulfur fuel marine gas oil. So not heavy fuel oil and wash water scrubbers. We'll set our opacity alarms at a very low rate. Every company that comes into Glacier Bay has agreed to not discharge a single drop of wastewater, either treated or untreated gray or black water. So no wastewater comes in the park. And for most of in fact, all the companies in this concessions prospectus responded and said, not only will they do that just while they're operating the park, they won't do it while they're anywhere near the park, so in the area. Again, a whole suite of operating conditions that increases the sustainability in response to this competitive market, including a value that we find very important, visitor experience. They will pass out brochures to every passenger the day before they come into the park, so they know when they're in Glacier Bay. There's this last one down in the bottom, which I've listed under monitoring research. The ship companies that were awarded contract voluntarily proposed to pay on a per passenger basis between 18 and 38 US per passenger per ship visit. So again, we didn't write that in. That's what they proposed to do. So, if you can imagine two ships that come in per day, each one carrying 4,000 passengers, if they had proposed $25 per passenger, that's in a single day, that's $200,000 that comes back to the National Park Service, 80% of which we can utilize for monitoring or research or understanding impacts or enforcement or essentially protecting the resources and values as a result of having that type of visitation. So one of the things I'm often asked is that's often ports of call are confronted with is, they don't want to limit ship volume because they're limiting ship revenue. And this is not a super fair comparison because of the differences between port of call, but I just mapped this just as an example. I live in Juneau, about 70 miles east of Glacier Bay. Again, we have up to 5 large ships per day. And in 2022, in Juneau, during the June through August season, there was 322 large ship port calls during that time period. And there were 153 in Glacier Bay. And because of the concession prospectus, there was on average about $24.50 that came into the Park Service as a result of companies proposing those per passenger fees. In the Port of Juneau, they get about $13 per passenger based on excise taxes or port fees or whatever. And the result is that even though the Glacier Bay receives less than half of the ship volume, it receives about the same amount of money, revenue, as a result of the ships coming in. And it's also really important to note that of the $13 in Juneau, only about $5 per passenger can be allocated to understanding and mitigating the impacts of cruise tourism. So implementing air quality studies or things like that. So effectively allocated toward conservation and purposes, Glacier Bay has less than 1/2 of the ships but 2.5 times the revenue that comes into the port of call. And again, passengers stay on the vessels in Glacier Bay. In Juneau, they get off, they buy t-shirts, they go on whale watching tours. So the economic impact, it's not an apples to apples comparison, but just an insightful exercise. So again, I can provide copies of the prospectus or the existing contracts if you're interested in understanding what those look like and what the companies propose in terms of sustainable operations. The last thing that I'm going to cover kind of in detail is education. The Park Service views interpretation and education as an extraordinarily important component of sustainable operations. So connecting the passengers to the sites, to the cultural history, to the importance of Glacier Bay as homeland to the Huna Tlingit, to understanding climate change, to understanding what they're seeing from the natural resources and the values that are trying to conserve. So in that prospectus, there's a very simple paragraph that says there needs to be an education interpretation program in place. Will you pay for it yourself by constructing your own interpretation program, and that program needs to meet all the rigorous protocols by which the Park Service has designated, or will you pay back the Park Service for putting that interpretation program together? And every company that has a permit has agreed for 100% cost recovery of their educational program. So Glacier Bay has a very rigorous interpretation program paid for 100% on 100% cost recovery by the cruise companies that are afforded contracts. That includes the expense of purchasing, maintaining, and operating a vessel that takes a team of 3 interpretation rangers out to every cruise ship that comes into Glacier Bay. Once they're on board the ships, they conduct interpretation and outreach efforts. This is an example of in the theater. They're very, very well attended by the passengers, slideshows connecting people to place. They're on the decks conducting outreach efforts on the loudspeaker so that they're connecting people when you get up to the Tidewater glaciers and interpreting both the natural and cultural history of the area. They conduct onboard special programs. It's a very well received program, very much enhances visitor experience. And this includes even published materials to make sure that people are connecting. Like I mentioned, brochures go out to passengers in their cabins before they reach the park the day before, so they know what they're looking at and where they are when they come in. So why does it work? Well, one thing is that people know when they come into a national park or World Heritage Site, they're coming into a special place. So companies can put those places on their itineraries and charge more because it has that brand recognition. So even if people aren't necessarily familiar with what's going to happen, they know they're getting someplace good, and companies can utilize that. And quite frankly, there's no other Glacier Bay, there's no other Pond Inlet, there's no other Northeast Greenland National Park. So they're special places, and people recognize that, and companies want exclusive access to it. There's a bit of a self-sustaining loop with the interpretation program that companies want people to have great experiences, and the interpretation program is very well received and enhances that. And we regularly get 90-95% of responses post cruise that Glacier Bay was the coveted day on the ship, that they had extremely high or very high experience while they're in the park. The companies have proposed these fees. We didn't embark. We didn't say here's what you have to pay, and those fees are relatively small compared to the total expenditures for the cruise that people typically spend. So it's sustainable. And in addition to that, we're not asking anything of the companies that's not technologically possible. So we didn't put in the prospectus that every company that is going to award a contract has to operate on fuel cells. that, it's just not feasible to bring in 700,000 visitors to enjoy and access the Tidewater Glacier onboard cruise ships that operate solely on fuel cells. So it's something that we do that maximizes sustainability given what the technology that's installed on board at the time. And of course, the competitive nature of this. So um, I only have a few more minutes. And again, I'm sorry it's that we started a little late, but I'm going to enter my arm waving phase here. So feel free to phase out if you want. But having worked on this and seeing the evolution of this system, it works best when companies compete for the ports of call or come into an area rather than ports of call competing for companies. And you don't have to look very far south in the Caribbean when you have a suite of sovereign nations that they're competing for the cruise companies to come to those ports. And it's kind of a race to the bottom in terms of trying to attract those ports of call. And it just doesn't, when you set up the competitive nature, you want them to compete to come to those areas. And so there is definitely a role for national level initiatives that say, it doesn't matter what it is, you're going to embark on an environmental port index or something that is consistent where the companies can't just say, well, we're going to go to the next port. We don't have to be there. I often get a question about, what would you do now to, if for a developing port, and that's like, these companies are out for profit. We're not blaming them for that, but there are companies in Alaska that fly people into Vancouver and they stay at a company-owned hotel and they get on a company-owned ship and they take the inside passage and then they get off on a bus in Seward, Alaska, and they go stay at a company-owned lodge in Denali National Park. And that's vertical integration. So they're capturing revenue at every one of the steps. And so, some of the remote areas, especially in the Arctic, if possible, getting mechanisms in place for local revenue capture is possible. The other thing is that, like, I've noticed a lot of times cruise associations that represent multiple companies kind of start with no when you start to enter into these voluntary agreements. And when you work directly with the companies, there are some phenomenal people to work with in the industry who have sustainability as a value within those companies. And so I tend to default to working and communicating directly with the companies. I was in a meeting with Bob Simpson at Silversea at the Sea Trade meetings, and he said we work with ACO on where Silversea ships go, but we view that as a starting point and not an ending point. And that's really what you want to do. You want to see what the companies are willing to do, because oftentimes it may be more than what the lowest common denominator is for an association representing. And I'm going to win the award here for the dumbest, most naive, easier said than done statement. We've seen time and time and again in Alaska, don't wait for an incident to happen. We had a ship last year that lost propulsion power in Glacier Bay for 7 minutes. It drifted, and Glacier Bay doesn't take very much drift space before you're on the beach. And luckily they were able to get the engines online. But unlike some of the other ships where they've gone black for 4 days and drifting in the Gulf of Mexico, it's like, don't wait for an incident to start to implement some of these strategies. So I think my last slide here is that for those of you that are in the marine protected area business, I know that you're probably aware there's been this ongoing debate about, do you set aside, a single large marine protected area to achieve your conservation goals or several small? I'm going to introduce you to a new acronym here, which I just made up last night, called SLOMS rather than SLOS, single large, several small. SLOMS, single large, or many, many small. And okay, it's a dumb idea and a dumb term, but nevertheless, hear me out. Like, everyone looks at these large cruise ships and says, oh, they're floating cities, they're 4,000 passengers, and that's right. But for at least for our objectives, we're trying to get a large number and diversity of passengers to the Tidewater glaciers, and there's something to be said about putting all those people on a single ship, and they go to these theaters. And I can tell you without question that that is the demographic that we need to reach to discuss and highlight the implications of climate change, or protected area, suite of protected areas for conserving ecological goods and services, or a number of different interpretation themes where you can have people see directly and experience those impacts while they're on the ships. And so, you know, like if for example, we had two ships that come in with 4,000 passengers, that's 8,000 passengers. If we said, you know what, we're not going to have these large floating cities come into the park, we're going to have electric catamarans that have an 80-person capacity come in instead. Well, you know, in order to achieve the same level of visitation, 8,000 passengers, if you had 80 people on a catamaran, that's 100 catamarans that would have to leave over the course of, you know, these two ships come in, they're there at any one point and they're gone in 45 minutes. They're, you know, you don't even know they're there anymore. You'd have to have those catamarans leave, you know, 100 catamarans leaving the same area and capacity to achieve the same level of visitation. So there's something to be said about the slums. Maybe you'll never hear that term again, but oh, and I guess the last thing I want to say is that, you know, I know many areas don't have regulation. They say, well, we can't regulate the volume that comes in, but, you know, any shipping entity, any shipping situation has some limiting factor. And like in the Panama Canal, they don't limit the volume of ships that go through the Panama Canal. But what they do is they impose certain environmental standards that says, we're going to give you early access or priority access through the canal if you operate according to certain environmental standards. And, you know, those limitations, you know, docking by the Sydney Harbor, or, you know, even dock space in some of these places represents a limiting factor that can be leveraged in a competitive market that I think can parlay into more sustainable operations. So anyways, I close now. You know, I'm doing a big emissions inventory for all the large ships in Glacier Bay. I was on the Nordam last year, and I thought this is funny because, you know, when we're embarking on managing cruise ships, you know, there's no operating manual, but you would think that there's no operating manual on these large cruise ships, but in fact there are. And I I was shocked to see that and it's not a very large or long operating manual. I was on the Nordam last year, and there's a 2-volume operating manual, as if Holland America bought the ship and they were like, well, how do we run this thing? Well, let's look at the operating manual. So anyways, thank you for your time. I'm sorry for the delay in for getting online, for our server being down. I guess we'll take questions now, and I'll stop sharing my screen, maybe.
Yeah. Why don't you do that? And then we can, if people want to turn on their cameras for a conversation, we can do that.
Okay. It shows I'm not sharing my screen anymore. Is that what you're showing?
I can still see it, but maybe it just takes a moment to come on down.
Okay.
Everything's a little slow today. Anna's got her hand up. Anna Barford from Standard. Anna, if you want to go ahead and ask your question, go for it.
Sure. Hi. Thanks, Scott, for the presentation. Really interesting stuff. I know that a couple of years ago, Princess Cruises was caught dumping illegally in Glacier Bay National Park. And I'm wondering if you can speak to some of the consequences that they experienced about access to the park, because they're still advertising access to Glacier Bay. And based on your presentation, I wasn't sure. Can you just on there?
Yeah. Great question. And it's going to be a long answer, so I'm sorry ahead of time, but I have to put it in context. So you're right. The Westerdam, the Princess Cruises it was actually a Holland America cruise. The Westerdam, I think it was in 2018. They had an incidental discharge of something on the order of 23,000 gallons of treated gray water that was dumped in Glacier Bay. So again, apologies for the long answer, but the first thing is that every cruise ship that comes in as part of their contracts has to point a point of contact, and any violation of any of the operating conditions, they're required to self-report right away. So in that instance, you know, we get we get dozens of these things over the last few years of like, oh, we had a passenger that was feeding, throwing bread overboard and there was gulls eating it. And so, that's in violation of their operating contract. And so they have to self-report and they have to give us a report on how they're going to fix the problem. And almost immediately they are. So in terms of that incidental discharge, that was not an insignificant violation of the operating contract. And the Park Service, what happened was, and they got, really, and I think rightfully, a little bit bad press on this because they only ended up finding the Princess Cruises or Holland America. I don't know what it was. It was something on the order of hundreds or thousands of dollars. It wasn't very much. But what happens is that every cruise company that has a contract undergoes an annual review of how well that they met their contract stipulations. And if those companies get 2 negative reviews, their contracts can be canceled. So they would be prohibited from entering the park, not just for the rest of their contract, but also they would be prohibited from competing for a contract in the next prospectus 10-year cycle. So they could have a potential of being kicked out of the park for up to 20 years based on whenever that violation occurred. So the Park Service, they immediately reported. The Park Service put it on their administrative record, and that is equivalent to something that would be double secret probation, but it's not a secret. Another violation, another negative review, annual review, would potentially result in them being kicked out of the park. So because they work very closely with the Park Service on why it happened, when it happened, immediately how it was resolved, they still got an administrative record, but they weren't necessarily kicked out of their contract or the park for the remainder of their contract. It's an issue that was, I think, very important to recognize that we can only fine the ships a certain level, and I don't remember what it is, but it's something on the order of several $1,000s for an incident. And it wouldn't matter if we maximize that fine or not. That would have been a slap on the wrist. What the real incentive for these companies is that they need to abide by their operating standards, by their in their contracts. Otherwise, they risk losing those contracts and getting kicked out of the park and not having ability to come back in the park for up to several decades. So, it's above my pay scale when I make those decisions, who makes those decisions as to administratively whether or not to kick them out of the park, what constitutes a significant violation for a negative review. Those undergo a very long administrative review at the end of each year. We do have a program in place where we put individual or independent they're not they're marine engineers, but they're retired Coast Guard inspectors where they have surprise inspections that go on the ships and make sure that they're operating according to their contracts. It's a program that was put in place last year. It's the second year of the program now. The state of Alaska used to have this program called the Ocean Ranger program, where they put certified marine engineers on 70 or 80% of the ships that for their entire time in Alaska. They have since revamped that program. So the Park Service has required that independent inspectors conduct surprise inspections for every ship that comes into Glacier Bay twice per summer. So, and those inspectors go out with the interpretive rangers, and the ships have no idea that the inspectors are getting on board on those days. And it's just another way of ensuring that they're abiding by their contract requirements.
It's a great question, Anna. Thanks so much for that answer, Scott. Now, would it be possible to just drop your email into the chat if anybody wanted to follow up with you and ask further questions? Just noting we're at the end of our time today. and really appreciate your presentation. That was a lot of food for thought. And just to reiterate, we'll be sending out the link to the recording after this presentation. So you can follow up on anything you missed or reach out to Scott directly if you have a question pertaining to your own situation. And always, we're looking for future speakers. So if you have a topic you'd like to share, please let me know. And thanks to everyone for participating today. Thank you so much, Scott.